I never thought moving into Meadowbrook Estates would turn into a political nightmare, but that was before I met Karen Hutchins, our HOA president. The woman had turned suburban governance into her personal fiefdom, and I was about to become her latest target. What she didn't know was that I'd spent 15 years as a city planner before semi-retiring at 42, and I had connections that ran deeper than her perfectly manicured lawn. The trouble started 3 weeks after I moved in. I was unloading groceries when Karen appeared at the end of my driveway, clipboard in hand, lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. Well, Mr. Patterson, is it? I'm Karen Hutchins, HOA president. We need to discuss your flagrant violations. I'd been in the neighborhood less than a month. Violations seemed unlikely. She proceeded to list them anyway. My mailbox was 0.3 inches too tall according to the HOA guidelines. My lawn furniture was visible from the street, which violated the aesthetic standards outlined in Section 7, Paragraph 12 of the Covenant. And my car, a perfectly respectable sedan, had been parked in my driveway overnight on 2 occasions, which was only permitted 3 times per week. I smiled politely and promised to review the HOA documents more carefully. That should have been the end of it. With Karen, nothing was ever the end. Over the next 2 months, I received 17 violation notices. My garden gnome was too whimsical. My window treatments weren't uniform enough. I'd retrieved my trash cans from the curb at 6:03 post-meridium instead of by 600 post-meridium. Each notice came with a $50 fine and Karen's signature, always with an unnecessarily aggressive underline. Before we go any further, I'd really appreciate it if you could hit that like button and subscribe to KarenEatWorld. Trust me, you're going to want to see where this story goes, and I've got plenty more tales of entitled people getting exactly what they deserve. Now, back to Karen and her reign of suburban terror. I tried the reasonable approach first. I attended an HOA meeting and politely suggested that perhaps the enforcement was becoming a bit excessive. Karen literally laughed. Mr. Patterson, if you can't handle living in a community with standards, perhaps you should have purchased property elsewhere. Some of us take pride in maintaining property values. The other board members nodded along like bobbleheads. I noticed they all lived on Karen's street. Funny how that worked. Then came the incident with my sister's visit. She'd driven up from Florida in her RV, planning to stay in my driveway for a long weekend. I'd even checked the rules. Recreational vehicles were permitted for guests for up to 72 hours. But apparently, Karen had decided 72 hours meant exactly 72 hours, not 72 hours and 15 minutes. She called a towing company at 2:15 ante-meridium on the 4th day, while my sister was sleeping inside. The tow truck driver actually felt bad about it, but a call was a call. My sister woke up to her RV being dragged down the street. That cost me $800 in towing and impound fees, plus an emergency $250 fine for the overstay. When I confronted Karen, she smiled with all the warmth of a tax audit. Rules are rules, Mr. Patterson. Perhaps next time your guests will be more respectful of our community standards. She'd been watching my house with a stopwatch. Who does that? But the real escalation came when I installed solar panels. I'd done everything by the book, gotten the proper permits from the city, hired licensed contractors, even chosen panels that lay flat and were barely visible from the street. Solar installations were protected by state law. HOA covenants couldn't prohibit them. I knew this because I'd helped write some of the city ordinances around renewable energy installations during my city planning days. Karen, however, saw this as a declaration of war. The violation notice arrived the same day the installation was completed. According to Karen, the panels violated the neighborhood's uniform roofline aesthetic and created an eyesore that would devastate property values. The fine was $500. I wrote back citing the state statute that protected solar installations. She responded with a letter from an HOA attorney threatening legal action and daily fines until I removed them. The attorney's letter was all bluster, no substance. Any first-year law student could have torn it apart. But it showed me how far Karen was willing to go. I attended another HOA meeting with copies of the relevant state laws. I explained calmly and clearly that the solar panels were legally protected and that pursuing this matter would expose the HOA to significant legal liability. Karen's response was to call an emergency vote to amend the covenants to ban solar panels specifically. She actually said this out loud, in front of witnesses. The fact that you can't retroactively ban something that's already legally installed didn't seem to register. The other board members shifted uncomfortably. Even they could see this was insane. But Karen had been president for 8 years, and nobody wanted to cross her. The vote passed 4-1, with one brave soul abstaining. Karen announced that I had 30 days to remove my solar panels or face daily fines of $100. She was practically grinning. That's when I made some phone calls. See, during my years in city planning, I'd worked closely with the mayor's office, the city council, and various department heads. I'd helped navigate some complicated zoning issues, facilitated some important development projects, and built relationships with people who actually understood how municipal government worked. I'd even gone to college with the current mayor, Tom Richardson. We'd stayed friendly over the years. I invited him to lunch. Tom listened to my story over sandwiches, his expression growing darker with each detail. Karen Hutchins, you said? Meadowbrook Estates? Yeah, we've had complaints about that HOA before. She's made herself quite the nuisance. He leaned back in his chair, thinking. You know, the city's been looking at ways to address abusive HOA enforcement. We've had several residents complain about similar issues. Maybe it's time we did something about it. I mentioned that I'd noticed Meadowbrook Estates had several covenant requirements that seemed to conflict with city ordinances. The restrictions on solar panels, obviously, but also the rules about vegetable gardens, the prohibition on certain vehicle types, and the aesthetic requirements that effectively ban accessibility modifications. Tom's eyes lit up. Is that so? You know, that might fall under our authority to investigate. HOA covenants can't supersede municipal code. We talked for another hour. I might have mentioned that I'd kept meticulous records of every violation notice, every fine, every threatening letter. I might have also mentioned that I'd talked to other residents who'd been similarly harassed but were too afraid of retaliation to complain publicly. Tom assured me the city would look into it. He had that look I remembered from our planning days, the one that meant wheels were turning. 2 weeks later, I received a certified letter from the city. Meadowbrook Estates HOA was being formally investigated for potential violations of municipal code and state law. The investigation would examine the legality of various covenant provisions, enforcement practices, and whether the HOA had exceeded its authority. During the investigation, all HOA fines and enforcement actions were suspended pending review. Karen must have received her copy the same day, because she showed up at my door within an hour, face red, practically vibrating with rage. You did this. You called the city. Do you have any idea what you've done? I smiled pleasantly. I simply provided information when asked. The city has every right to ensure HOA covenants comply with municipal law. I'm sure everything will be fine if the HOA hasn't done anything wrong. She sputtered something about lawyers and revenge and stomped back to her house. I'd never seen her so angry. It was deeply satisfying. The investigation took 6 weeks. I may have provided the city attorney's office with detailed documentation. I may have also connected them with 4 other residents who'd been subjected to Karen's harassment campaigns. One had been fined repeatedly for having a wheelchair ramp that didn't match the approved aesthetic. Another had been threatened with legal action for planting tomatoes in their backyard. The more the city dug, the worse it looked. The findings were damning. 23 separate HOA covenant provisions were found to be legally unenforceable because they conflicted with state or municipal law. The enforcement practices were deemed arbitrary and potentially discriminatory. The fine structure was found to be excessive and punitive beyond what was legally permissible. The city ordered the HOA to revise its covenants, refund improperly collected fines, and implement oversight procedures. Karen was personally named in the report for her role in the aggressive enforcement practices. But that wasn't the best part. The best part came when Tom called me with an interesting opportunity. The city was planning a new public works project, a community park and recreation center. They needed land. Specifically, they needed a 4-acre parcel in a residential area with good access and central location. They were considering several sites, including one in Meadowbrook Estates. There was an empty lot at the end of Karen Street, currently owned by a developer who'd gone bankrupt. The lot had been in limbo for 3 years. Tom wondered if I might have any interest in how the city proceeded. I did some research. The lot was in foreclosure, being sold by the bank. It was zoned residential, but city parks are allowed in residential zones with proper approvals. The lot happened to back directly onto Karen's property. Her house was the closest residence. A public park there would mean traffic, parking, noise, evening activities, weekend sports leagues, maybe summer concerts. Everything Karen hated. Everything that would shatter her quiet, controlled little world. I made another call, this time to a former colleague who now worked in the city's Parks and Recreation Department. We'd worked together on several green space projects. I explained the situation and suggested the Meadowbrook location would serve an underserved area. There were no public parks within 2 miles. The neighborhood kids had nowhere to play. It would be a real community asset. She loved the idea. The fact that it would also resolve the problem of an abandoned eyesore property made it even more appealing from a planning perspective. The city moved forward with the proposal. There would be a public hearing, of course. Community input would be gathered. But the Parks Department was enthusiastic, the City Council was supportive, and the bank was eager to unload the property. I attended the hearing and spoke in favor of the park, citing the need for community recreation space and the benefits of developing the abandoned lot. I was articulate, well-prepared, and completely reasonable. Several other residents spoke in support. Parents loved the idea of a nearby park. Kids were excited about having a playground and sports fields. Karen, predictably, opposed it. She gave an impassioned speech about property values, neighborhood character, and the sanctity of residential zones. She claimed a park would bring crime, noise, and undesirable elements. She submitted a petition with 17 signatures, all from her street. The city council listened politely, and then voted 6-1 in favor of the park. The one dissenting vote came from a council member who represented a different district entirely, and just generally opposed park spending. Then came my masterstroke. The city needed someone to help with the park planning, someone with experience in municipal projects and community development. As a consultant, of course. Pro bono even. I volunteered. Tom thought that was very civic-minded of me. The Parks Department was grateful to have someone with my expertise. And just like that, I had significant input into every aspect of the park's design and programming. I suggested a dog park. A big one, with separate areas for large and small dogs. It would be very popular. The city loved it. I recommended evening sports leagues, maybe until 9 post-meridium or 10 post-meridium during summer months. Great for working parents. Excellent community building. I proposed weekend farmers markets and summer concert series. The parks director thought these were fantastic ideas. I even suggested a skate park for teenagers, with proper sound barriers, of course, though sound would still carry during peak use times. Every suggestion was reasonable, beneficial to the community, and would absolutely drive Karen insane. The park planning moved forward quickly. The city was eager to break ground on a positive community project. I made sure to keep Karen informed, in the most professional way possible. As a concerned neighbor and involved citizen, I thought she should know about the plans. I hand-delivered copies of all the design proposals, the programming schedule, the traffic studies. I wanted her to see exactly what was coming. Her face when she reviewed the dog park plans was priceless. "You're putting a dog park 30 feet from my property line? The noise, the smell, the mess." I nodded sympathetically. Yes, the city's really committed to this. Studies showed dog parks increase community engagement and property values overall. I'm sure you'll get used to it. The traffic study projected around 200 visitors per day on average, more on weekends. The summer concert series would run from May through September. The farmers' market would operate every Saturday morning. The sports leagues would run 6 nights a week. Karen tried to fight it. She hired a lawyer to challenge the zoning approval. The lawyer quickly informed her that the city had followed all proper procedures and the zoning was entirely appropriate. She tried to organize neighborhood opposition, but most residents were excited about the park. Families saw it as a major amenity. Only Karen's immediate neighbors, the ones who'd rubber-stamped her HOA reign of terror, shared her opposition. She demanded another city council hearing. They granted it, and then voted 6-1 in favor again. She was losing, and she knew it. If you're enjoying this story of Karen getting a taste of her own medicine, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to KarenEatWorld. I've got tons more stories about entitled people facing epic karma, and you won't want to miss a single one. Now let's get to the best part. Construction began in March. The groundbreaking ceremony was well attended. The mayor gave a speech about community and green spaces. Local kids were excited about the playground equipment. I stood near the back, watching Karen watch from her front window. She didn't come out. She didn't participate. She just watched, arms crossed, face like stone. The construction noise started at 700 anti-meridium, the earliest allowed by city ordinance. It would continue for 6 months. But I wasn't done. See, during the planning process, I'd noticed something interesting. Karen's house, her fortress of HOA power, had a few quirks. The property survey showed her fence encroached 8 inches onto the city's easement. Her sprinkler system crossed into public right-of-way. Her decorative landscaping, the elaborate setup she was so proud of, violated setback requirements. These were all things that had been grandfathered in over the years, overlooked because nobody cared enough to enforce them. Until the city started doing due diligence for the park development, and noticed these violations during their survey work. The city sent Karen a notice. The encroachments needed to be corrected before the park construction reached that phase. She'd need to move her fence back 8 inches, relocate her sprinkler system, and remove the landscaping that violated setbacks. This would need to be completed within 90 days. The cost would be entirely hers. The irony was so perfect I actually laughed out loud when Tom mentioned it to me over coffee. Karen, the violation queen, was in violation of actual municipal code. Not pretend HOA aesthetic standards, but real laws with real consequences. She tried to fight that too. She claimed the encroachments had been there for years and should be grandfathered. The city attorney explained that grandfathering only applied when the city wasn't actively developing adjacent property. The park construction meant they needed full access to their easements and right-of-way. She threatened to sue. Her lawyer advised against it. She'd lose, and she'd pay the city's legal fees on top of her own. She was trapped by the same kind of technical enforcement she'd used to terrorize her neighbors for years. The HOA fell apart without Karen's iron grip. After the city's investigation, several residents called for her removal as president. There was a special election. She lost badly. The new board immediately suspended all pending violations, refunded improper fines, and began revising the covenants to be actually reasonable. They even apologized to me personally. Karen was furious, but she was powerless. She'd lost her platform, her authority, and her ability to make other people's lives miserable. The park opened in November with a big community celebration. It was beautiful. Rolling green space, modern playground equipment, walking trails, the dog park, picnic areas, a small amphitheater for concerts. Families flooded in. Dogs barked happily. Kids screamed with joy on the swings. The noise carried clearly to Karen's house. Her backyard, once a private sanctuary, now overlooked a bustling public space. Her quiet street now had parking congestion every weekend. Her peaceful mornings were interrupted by dog walkers at 6 anti-meridium. Her evenings featured the sounds of youth sports leagues and the occasional concert. Property values on her street actually increased because of park proximity, which somehow made it worse. She couldn't even claim financial harm. The park was genuinely good for the neighborhood. It was good for everyone except Karen, who'd built her entire identity around control and exclusion. Now she had neither. I saw her occasionally, always looking bitter, always scowling at the park visitors who dared to exist near her property. The farmers' market became particularly popular. Every Saturday morning, vendors set up in the park parking lot. Local produce, baked goods, crafts, live music. It was charming. It drew hundreds of people. The traffic on Karen's street was insane. She couldn't even leave her driveway between 800 and 1300 hours on Saturdays without navigating through pedestrians and parked cars. She complained to the city multiple times. They responded that the market had all proper permits and was a beloved community event. They suggested she embrace the local economy and maybe visit the market herself. I don't think she appreciated that suggestion. I ran into her one Saturday at the market, actually. I was buying tomatoes from the same vendor who'd been fined by the HOA for growing them in his backyard. Karen appeared next to me, clearly having worked up the courage to confront me in public. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. The anger was still there, but it was mixed with something else. Defeat, maybe? Realization. You planned this. All of it. The city investigation, the park, everything. You destroyed my HOA, ruined my neighborhood, turned my street into a circus. All because of a few violation notices. She wasn't yelling. She just sounded tired. I considered my response carefully. I could have been gracious. I could have been kind. Instead, I smiled and told her the truth. Karen, you did this to yourself. You weaponized rules to make people miserable. You turned neighborhood governance into a personal power trip. You harassed people for parking violations and garden gnomes while ignoring actual community needs. You created an environment where people were afraid to live in their own homes. All I did was remind the city that HOA covenants don't supersede actual law and that our neighborhood could benefit from public amenities. Everything that happened after that was just proper municipal governance working as intended. I paused, holding my bag of tomatoes. The difference between you and me is that when I enforce rules, they're actually rules that matter. They're laws designed to protect people and serve communities, not arbitrary aesthetic standards designed to feed someone's ego. You taught me that following the letter of the law matters more than the spirit. You just didn't expect someone to use that lesson against you. Her face went through several colors. Red to white to purple. She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. The realization was dawning. The park wasn't just a park. It was every petty complaint she'd ever filed, magnified and made permanent. Every violation notice she'd sent was echoed in the sound of children playing 30 feet from her bedroom window. Every fine she'd assessed was reflected in her property fence being dismantled and moved. Every threat she'd made was answered by the constant flow of people enjoying public space she couldn't control. She'd spent 8 years making people follow her rules, and now she'd spend the rest of her life following rules that made her miserable. The system she'd worshipped had turned on her, and there was nothing she could do about it. It was legal. It was proper. It was permanent. And from the look in her eyes, she finally understood that I hadn't just beaten her. I'd used her own playbook to ensure she'd live with the consequences of her behavior every single day, watching from her window as the community she tried to control celebrated its freedom in the park she tried to stop. The park that would be there, thriving and noisy and joyfully chaotic, long after both of us were gone. If you loved seeing Karen get the ultimate karma, make sure you like this video and subscribe to KarenEatWorld for more stories of entitled people getting exactly what they deserve. Drop a comment telling me your favorite part of this story. Thanks for watching.